Not that I really love posting these weather videos anymore, but there are some astonishing statistics from so far this year and the way the weather turned out in New York City that this video really just was inevitable. So, first of all, what I want to touch on was the massive heat wave last week. It's going to be the warmest we're going to get in our area in probably about 2 months, I want to say. Especially given how the warm weather we were predicted for Friday has since turned back into still somewhat warm, but only about 68 degrees. So, what was so astonishing about that was how warm it got both during the day and night, and how consistent it was. So, nowhere in the metro area broke a record high on April 12th. That was because on that day in 1977, it hit like upper 80s, 90s, like everywhere. However, the low temperature of 64 in the city was enough to break a record. And I'm not sure about everywhere else, but there were probably quite a lot of record warm low temperatures broken. Islip at first appeared to have possibly had their second warmest April morning with a low of 61 degrees. However, by midnight, the temperature had crashed back to 55 after peaking at 83, which is still not a record, but the 55 was a record for the warmest low of the day. On April 13th, everywhere in the metro area broke a record, as Central Park soared to 90, which is the fourth earliest 90-degree temperature on record in the city. The temperature then hit 91 on April 14th, as Newark soared to 93 and Hartford made their way up to 96, tying for the warmest April temperature in Connecticut history. However, that date also marks something. No one, not even the NWS, has reported on it, but it is fact. It is the earliest date for a 70-degree low temperature in the city on record. The low that night did not fall below 70 degrees. Literally, it was 70 degrees for over 24 consecutive hours in April. And the low on April 13th, by the way, was still a record-breaking 67 degrees. But honestly, that's just a new level. Now, this heat wave did pass, and by April 14th, the high was only 75 degrees, which was at midnight as on the remnants of the summer-like warmth on the 14th. Temperatures did eventually begin to recover back to around where they should be, and for the first time in 4 nights, the low fell below 60 degrees when it fell to 59, although Newark still maintained a low above 60 for the 4th consecutive day. But, I mean, well, it's still notable. So, the takeaways from this is how early these warm readings are coming to us, a lot faster than they were last year. And I actually want to take a look at it, because last year had kind of a frigid January. When you look at it, our first day in the 60s this year in the city, in New York City, was January 4th. Last year, it was February 12th. Our first day in the 70s this year in the city was February 16th. Last year, it was March 7th. This year, our first date in the 80s was April 6th. Last year, it was May 21st. And this year we hit the 90s on April 13th, whereas last year it didn't happen until also May 21st. As far as low temps, last year there was a low temp in the city of 50 degrees on January 1st. I do have to give them credit for that. And this year, despite our stunningly warm January, the low at its warmest was 49. Still enough to break a record on January 2nd. However, our first 50-degree low in the city did not occur until February 16th. Note that all of this is for Central Park. I'm not using any of my own personal weather data anymore. Don't even know what a lot of the weather data is for all these days. I mean, I know it, but I don't take it to heart as much because not as important ultimately is what's going on in New York City. And that's why if you watch my earlier weather videos, they're all focused here. Don't do that anymore. Though sometimes I will make a few comparisons, but I'm not going to in this video. As far as that first low in the 60s, last year in the city that happened for the first time, I believe, May 14th. This year, that happened as early as April 12th, when we saw our first low temperature in the 60s and 70s. That April 14th is a record. Last year it happened on May 22nd. All right, so having said that, that was obviously a stark April heat wave, and when you think about it, it really just comes on the heels of one of our warmest winters on record. Now, as far as the season goes, there's a lot of notable stuff as far as the cold weather season goes. First of all, Central Park failed to hit the 50s until September 16th, when the temperature plunged its way down to 57 degrees. Now, I don't want to say that was the case everywhere. The city does have that urban heat island effect, and you know, it did get down to the 50s early on in a lot of the metro. Islip managed to hit 59 degrees, for example, on August 14th. Still, though, not in a city until September 16th. And as a matter of fact, the first 15 days of September all had lows at or above 62 degrees. That was anomalous, to say the least. And July only got down to 65. August only got down to 62. So from the start of the season for cold temperature, it took 2.5 months to get to the 50s. However, getting to the 40s happened a bit earlier than average when the city hit 49 degrees on September 24th. And low temperatures also depreciated greatly. I mean, the high temperature was only 63 degrees in the city on September 23rd, which was the first high in the 60s all year. And just so you know, in case you were wondering, as far as that high temperature in the 60s goes, it came a little bit earlier than last year. But as far as a lot of the other temperatures go, that wasn't exactly the case. In the 40s, obviously, last year, the first high in the 40s was on October 18th in the city, the second latest state on record. So this year was actually a bit earlier than average. However, for Central Park to swimmer its way to the 30s, that didn't happen until November 14th. Our second latest state on record, behind only 1938. I made a video about the November 1938 weather, so checking that out would be a wise idea. Now, as far as as far as the highs in the 40s, that was also the first time on November 14th. But that isn't so anomalous, and I think it was, in fact, a day earlier than 2021, when it didn't happen until November 15th. And our first freeze was right on time, November 19th, and by November 21st, temperatures were down in the 20s, with wind chills in the teens. So, obviously nothing too unusual there, right? Well, as much as we all like to think right, it wasn't meant to be. December at first seemed to be kind of like how March started off, with warm days and cold days kind of sprinkled in there. New York City had their longest stretch of below 50 weather during the month of December, from December 9th all the way until the 22nd. Every single day in the city was below 50 degrees. But on December 7th, there was a high of 59 and a low of 54 in the city. Not record-breaking, but still very warm, and still a low in the 50s nonetheless. Then, on December 23rd, the temperature shot up to 58 degrees. December 22nd had a high of 47 at midnight after a low of 35. And the temperature would rise 11 degrees more in the first 4 hours of the day to 58. That was the warmest temperature seen since December 7th, and in some areas, the warmest temperature seen all month. But Arctic air came crashing down, and then we hit 8 degrees. And for the first time in almost 4 years, we saw a temperature in the single digits and a high temperature that was below 20 degrees. So it actually was, in fact, very cold for a while. That being said, I do want to caution you on something. What you're going to understand about January is that it was so incredibly mild that when December 27th had a high of only 35 degrees, the next time that was repeated, a high so cold, was February 3rd. And it really wouldn't happen that much more throughout the course of the winter. Like, it really wouldn't. As a matter of fact, the low temp of, well, actually, I'm not going to spoil it for you. So, after this cold snap, though, there was another low in the 50s on December 31st. I know there were no lows in the 50s throughout all of January, but weirdly there was on December 31st under rainy skies, as the temp did hit 55 during the day. And the day before, it made its way up to 62. So, just throwing that out there. Now, as far as 2023 goes, the first freeze in 2023 in the city was on January 14th, second latest date on record. The low was 31 and the high was 38. So every single day in January was above average, and this was the only day with a below average high. There were, I think, 4 days, maybe 3 days with highs in the 30s, and there were also only, about 3 or 4 days that had lows below freezing. Only one day hit the 20s, and that was on January 16th, when the low hit 28, but the high rebounded to 48 after that. It was so mild during this time that LaGuardia did not hit the 20s at all during the month of January. But then they would hit the 20s for the first 5 days of February, as finally some good old-fashioned cold temperatures made their way into the city. An ice storm failed to produce any snow in the city, any measurable snow in the city. However, it did usher in cold air that would reduce the temperature down to 31 by midnight. And this is the most important part. The temperature finally hit 26 degrees on February 1st. And then the high only rebounded to 38. February 2nd had a high of 40 and a low of 29. On February 3rd, the high was 35 and the temperature tumbled down to 11. And the final sub-freezing high of the winter this year, that's right, the final one was on February 4th, when the high was 27, following a morning low of 3. The low of 27 on February 5th, just so you are aware, was the last time it would hit the 20s until February 18th, when there was another low of 27. The high hit 49. Now, February 23rd would have a sub-freezing low even where I live. Actually, the low was 32, which is exactly freezing. But the high in the city was 33, following a low of 23. And yes, just so you know, that was considered very brutal in this winter, even though it's only a few degrees below average. So not even that significantly below average, just a few degrees. And yeah, you can see the results. You can definitely see the results. So that was, I think, the biggest problem, was just the lack of how cold it could get. Now, the final freeze of the year was March 30th, which is also what it was last year in the city. The low temp hit 31 and the high was 46. The last high in the 40s likely for this season, which I don't want to say is really that late, because last year the last high in the 40s was on April 3rd. But the overall trend of March only hitting the 20s once on March 19th really just, it does show that a bit of a story there. And, you know, it wasn't just this anomalous warmth that made this winter a failure, but it was also, you know, mainly the lack of snow.